What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? The moment that defined my entire early adulthood did not come from a teacher, a boss, or even some life-or-death accident. It came from the people who were supposed to know me best, who were supposed to have my back, and it started with a lie told inside my own house. My sister, who was always the star in my parents' eyes, told them that I was sleeping around with random people and selling drugs out of my backpack. Not that she suspected, not that she overheard something, but that she knew it for a fact. And my parents, instead of looking at me and asking me directly, instead of remembering the years of me being careful, focused, and maybe a little too boring for my own good, chose to believe her without hesitation. One night of shouting later, I was out of the house with a duffel bag and no plan, wondering how a sibling rivalry turned into a sentence that would follow me for years. I could try to dress it up and tell you that I was brave, that I had a plan, but the truth is I cried in the bathroom at a friend's apartment and told myself I'd figure it out later. That later turned into a grind of taking shifts at a pharmacy, grabbing whatever hours I could, and living on a couch that wasn't really meant for long-term use. I was embarrassed, angry, and stubborn, but what really hit me wasn't just the money stress or the rejection. It was the way every adult I spoke to treated me differently once my own parents painted me as some kind of lost cause. It was as if one rumor, repeated by the people who should have defended me, had the power to erase all the years of good grades and decent behavior. And that was the first time I realized that when you don't have proof, people will fill in the blanks with whatever story fits their biases. That job at the pharmacy became more than just a paycheck. I learned that receipts matter, logs matter, documentation matters. Customers would yell about a charge, and the only way to shut it down was pulling out the system record and pointing at the timestamp. I started saving my own little records, printouts of pay stubs, screenshots of messages, even copies of my class schedules. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me a sense of control, like if I couldn't stop people from lying, I could at least arm myself with enough evidence to push back. Then came the first twist that made me stop seeing my sister's lies as just family drama and start treating them like an actual pattern of sabotage. I got a letter from a collections agency saying I owed money on a department store credit card. At first, I thought it was a scam, but when I called, the rep rattled off my social security number and an address I had never lived at. And the memory hit me like a hammer. Brooke once laughed about borrowing my number to get a discount. I had brushed it off as one of her stupid jokes, because who actually uses someone else's social security number as a punchline? Apparently, my sister. So I did something that scared me at the time but would later become the backbone of how I fought back. I filed a dispute. I didn't just yell on the phone or throw the letter away. I sat down, wrote a statement, and included a police report number I filed online for identity misuse. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't a courtroom showdown, but it worked. The creditor reversed the debt, the collection vanished, and, more importantly, the internal review flagged Brooke's phone number and email that were linked to the account. That was the moment I realized I didn't have to fight Brooke on her battlefield of whispers and manipulations. I could beat her with paperwork, systems, and receipts that she couldn't charm her way out of. I started a folder on my laptop titled Read Corrections. It became my private ledger of every wrong turn corrected, every falsehood reversed. It wasn't about revenge yet, not consciously, but it was the seed of it. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was documenting, preparing, setting up a trail that could someday flip the story back where it belonged. But nothing ever stays contained in one lane with family, does it? Just when I thought I had cleaned up one mess, another landed in my lap. My mom left a voicemail, her voice tight and accusing, saying I had ruined something important for my sister. She mentioned a venue, a non-refundable deposit, and an engagement announcement planned for summer. I had no idea what she was talking about, but the message was clear. Brooke was crying again, and somehow I was the villain. That was the first cliffhanger of many. The moment I realized that cleaning my name wasn't just about clearing up credit reports or getting rid of false debt. It was about walking into a storm my sister had built piece by piece, where every time I protected myself, she would spin it into another accusation. And while I didn't know it yet, This path of small corrections and quiet files would lead straight into the showdown that began with a text from my dad years later. "Can we talk? Your sister won't stop crying." When I thought about what it would take to really undo the damage my sister had done, I realized that proving myself in day-to-day life wasn't going to be enough, because even though I had a job, a place to stay, and slowly rebuilt some stability, the lies that Brooke had spread had become part of my official record, the one that schools and employers actually looked at, and that was the kind of stain you couldn't wash out just by saying you worked hard or stayed out of trouble. It hit me one afternoon while talking to Maya, who was filling out transfer forms for her own classes, that if high schools and colleges kept paper trails of grades and attendance, then they must also keep records of disciplinary accusations. And if Brooke's rumors were the reason my parents lost their trust in me, then odds were those same lies were written somewhere with my name attached to them. That thought made me both sick and strangely hopeful, because if the lies were written down, then there was a way to fight them with evidence rather than emotions. I decided to test the system, so I filed a formal request under FERPA, the Student Records Law, asking my old high school for a copy of everything that had ever been written about me, and when the envelope arrived, thick and heavy with copies of notes, I sat on my bed with my heart pounding, because deep down I already knew what I was about to find. Sure enough, in between normal entries about grades, attendance, and test scores, there were typed pages summarizing anonymous tips that I was selling pills from my backpack and sneaking around with older boys behind the gym. Tips that had apparently been treated as credible enough to forward to administrators. The dates lined up almost perfectly with the times Brooke and I had our worst fights at home, the kind of nights where she would scream about how I always got away with everything and how she was tired of being compared to me. Seeing it in black and white, knowing that my own sister had poisoned the adults in charge of my future, left me shaking, not because I didn't expect it, but because now I had the confirmation I needed to prove it wasn't just paranoia or exaggeration. I didn't march into the school demanding apologies, because I had already learned that anger never beats paperwork, so instead I drafted a calm, factual letter pointing out that during the exact dates of those supposed incidents, I had been clocked in at the pharmacy, which was documented by pay stubs and timesheets, and I attached copies of my report cards that showed consistent grades during the semesters in question, making it absurd to believe I was living some double life of dealing drugs and skipping class. I sent the packet back to the registrar and CC'd the transfer office at my university so they would see the correction on the record, and a week later I got a short reply from my old guidance counselor, Ms. Dalton, who admitted off the record that the anonymous tips had been flagged as family-provided concerns, which was their polite way of saying that my sister and maybe even my parents had fed them gossip, and she said she was sorry for the harm caused. That small line, family-provided concerns, confirmed what I had suspected all along. My downfall had been engineered inside my own home. What mattered most to me was the official addendum they agreed to add to my file, a simple note stating no evidence found, and students' accounts substantiated by employment and academic records. It didn't erase the fact that the accusations had once been written, but it rewrote the ending in a way that anyone reviewing my history would see the truth rather than the smear. For the first time in years, I felt like I was pulling my reputation back into my own hands, and the satisfaction was quiet but overwhelming, like finally locking a door that had been left open too long. Around the same time, my Aunt Carla, who had always been more practical than sympathetic, mentioned something odd she had noticed years back. A strange IRS transcript request tied to my social security number that she dismissed at the time because she assumed it was a mistake. Now, with everything I had uncovered, it didn't look like a mistake at all. It looked like Brooke or someone close to her had been trying to peek into my tax records, probably out of spite or greed. That detail went straight into my Read Corrections folder, because I knew sooner or later it would matter. The irony is that while I was carefully patching up my past with documentation, Brooke was out there panicking about her future, and the proof landed in my lap when Maya texted me a screenshot of Brooke begging an old classmate to delete their old messages about moving stuff because she was terrified her fiancé's family might find out about them. In other words, The same sister who had painted me as a dealer in order to destroy my standing was now terrified that her own reckless texts might undo her engagement. I didn't jump to expose her or send the messages around, because I had learned patience, and I knew there would be a better time to use that knowledge. But what mattered in that moment was realizing that the lies she had thrown at me were circling back to her, and the cracks in her perfect image were starting to show. All I had to do was keep building my file, keep collecting the proof, and wait for the right opportunity. And as I stared at those old messages, proof of her hypocrisy sitting right there on my phone, I couldn't help but feel that the balance was finally starting to shift. And the question that haunted me wasn't whether she would eventually collapse under the weight of her own lies, but whether I would be the one to push or simply stand back and let gravity do the work. That question hung in the air, heavy and unresolved, because I knew the moment was coming when she wouldn't just be gossiping about me, she would be begging me for mercy. By the time I pieced together the school records, the credit dispute, and the scattered comments from my aunt about strange IRS requests, it became clear that what I was dealing with wasn't just family drama or casual gossip, but a full-blown pattern of sabotage that had real consequences in the adult world, consequences that could show up in a background check, a loan application, or even something as basic as my ability to file taxes without raising red flags. And once I understood that, I knew I had to stop treating it like an emotional wound and start treating it like a legal problem that required paperwork, deadlines, and signatures, because feelings didn't erase records, but filings could. One of my classmates, Eric, who was about to start law school, became a quiet ally in this process because he was fascinated by the way personal disputes played out in official systems. And he kept reminding me that I didn't need to sue anyone or drag my sister into court to win. I just needed to create a paper trail that would protect me and quietly corner her into accountability she couldn't avoid. He showed me how to file an identity theft affidavit, which at first sounded dramatic, like something reserved for people whose bank accounts had been emptied by strangers. But the truth is, the moment Brooke used my social security number to open that card, whether she thought it was funny or harmless or clever, she crossed into territory where my name and her actions were entangled, and I couldn't afford to let that stand unchallenged. So I sat down and filled out the affidavit, carefully attaching the store card reversal, the police report number I had obtained during the dispute, and the timeline of how the charges had appeared under my name. Submitting that single form meant the IRS would tag my file and issue me an identity protection PIN, which essentially meant that if anyone tried to file taxes or request transcripts using my social security number without my knowledge, it would be blocked, flagged, and traced back. The act of putting that safeguard in place gave me a kind of peace I hadn't felt since the day I was kicked out, because for the first time, I knew that no matter how charming or manipulative my sister could be in conversation, she couldn't charm her way through an automated block built into the IRS system. At the same time, Eric encouraged me to draft a calm, almost boring letter to the local police department, simply updating the record by attaching the old credit dispute case number, the affidavit, and a note explaining that a family member had misused my personal information in the past. I wasn't asking them to drag her into an interrogation room or press charges. I was simply ensuring that if her name and my name ever collided again in a report or investigation, there would already be context on file pointing to me as the victim, not the suspect. It was preemptive, strategic, and completely free of the emotional chaos that usually swirled around our family fights, and in that sense it felt like the first adult decision I had ever made. The next step was freezing my credit across the major bureaus, which felt tedious but essential, because the last thing I needed was waking up one morning to find out a car loan or a payday loan had been opened in my name. By locking my credit and setting alerts, I knew that any future attempts would come directly to me for approval, and that meant Brooke's access to my identity was officially over. It was boring armor, but armor nonetheless, and I started to understand why Eric kept calling this process adult self-defense. The real confirmation that I was moving in the right direction came only a few weeks later, when my aunt forwarded me a notice she had received about another attempted IRS transcript pull under my social security number, which had now been blocked because of the PIN I had activated. That small, impersonal notice, with its sterile government language, gave me more satisfaction than any dramatic confrontation ever could, because it meant that my quiet, methodical steps were not just symbolic. They were actively shutting down my sister's reach into my life, and they were doing it in ways she couldn't manipulate with tears or excuses. Of course, the universe has a way of reminding you that victories never stay private forever, and mine came on the morning of my graduation week, when my phone lit up with a call from my father, a call I hadn't seen in years. One I stared at for a long minute before deciding not to answer, only to have the text message arrive seconds later. "Can we talk? Your sister won't stop crying." It was a strange, almost surreal moment, because here I was, finally stepping into a milestone that I had earned entirely on my own, without family support, without handouts. And suddenly the very people who had discarded me years earlier were trying to re-enter my life on their terms, dragged not by guilt or love, but by the fallout of my sister's own actions finally catching up to her. I didn't respond right away, partly because I wanted to savor the silence, but also because I knew instinctively that this wasn't a simple apology call. It was a negotiation disguised as reconciliation. And I was no longer the scared teenager with a duffel bag. I had receipts, I had filings, I had protections that couldn't be undone by charm or pressure, and for the first time in my life, I held the power to decide how and when this conversation would happen. And as I put my phone face down and focused on the day ahead, I couldn't help but think that the timing wasn't an accident. My sister had managed to cry her way out of so many situations before, but this time, with the paperwork stacked against her. The only way forward for my family was through me, and that realization was both terrifying and exhilarating, because it meant the tables had finally turned, and the next move was mine to make. I spent the morning of the dinner in a kind of focused quiet that did not feel like calm so much as it felt like a long inhale before a dive. And while the coffee went cold beside my elbow, I read through the trust documents again with the patience of someone who has decided that the only way to make people tell the truth is to place their own words in front of them and remove every exit sign from the room. And the attorney, who spoke in a measured way that made complicated things sound almost ordinary, walked me line by line through the hardship clause that my parents had loved to brag about when it made them look generous, and that they had learned to ignore when it required them to be actually generous. And she explained how an accounting demand works and how a petition is filed and how quickly a judge can order records to be produced when beneficiaries are being treated like nuisances rather than family. And as she talked, I could feel the story that had ruled my life for years becoming something smaller, something that could fit on a page with a signature and a file stamp and a date. I asked her to prepare every letter in duplicate and to include the language about breach of fiduciary duty, not because I wanted a courtroom showdown or a headline, but because I wanted my parents to hold a piece of paper that did not care about casseroles or holiday pictures or the tone my mother uses when she wants to make me feel unreasonable, and I watched her print the packets and slide them into heavy envelopes with the calm of someone who does this every day. Then I took out the cosigner withdrawal letter that had sat in my drawer like a splinter and asked her to attach a short explanation of its financial consequences, because when my father walked away from that document, he did not just walk away from a promise. He triggered interest and fees that hit like small hammers every month, and I wanted that cause and effect laid out so cleanly that even a man who prefers stories to facts would have to admit what his signature did. On my way home, I stopped at the hospital because I wanted a letter from the billing office that did not equivocate, and the supervisor, who remembered me as the mother who always showed up with a notebook and a quiet voice, printed a one-page confirmation that the payment plan originally approved on the basis of a grandparent cosignature had been canceled at the cosigner's request and replaced with terms that were significantly harsher. And she stapled it with a sympathetic look that I accepted without comment, because sympathy is not a currency that buys back anything that matters. And then I walked through the pediatric wing where the new families sit with the same stunned faces I used to see in the mirror. And I reminded myself that none of this was about punishing people for sport. It was about forcing the money to finally do what it should have done the first time we asked. Back at my apartment, I opened the envelope from the school bursar and spread the itemized tuition history across the table next to a printout of the donor plaque dedication. And I put small sticky flags on the months that overlap with our worst hospital stays because I wanted a timeline that reads like a confession even if no one in that dining room ever speaks the words out loud. And when I reached the week my mother gave her church speech about rallying around families in medical crisis, a week that also shows a full semester payment clearing out of their account, I added one more flag and wrote a question in the margin that I knew I would read aloud, not to embarrass her in front of the pastor, but to make sure the pastor understands exactly which sermon he will be blessing when he lifts his hands over dinner. Ethan called again to test my resolve, circling the same tired phrases about keeping things civil and not ruining the relationships the kids have with their grandparents. And when he realized that guilt was not budging anything inside me, he shifted to the language of money, suggesting that perhaps in the future there could be a private settlement that would spare everyone the shame of documents being waved around like weapons. And I told him I was not waving anything, I was arranging facts in chronological order so that excuses cannot hide between them, and I reminded him that the trust clause he loves when tuition is due does not change its meaning when a child is sick, and he hung up on me with a threat about how this will backfire, which I saved like all the rest because ugly sentences have a way of shrinking when the person who wrote them hears them out loud in a room where people they want to impress are listening. In the afternoon, I wrote the simplest plan I could manage, just a short letter that I would slide across the table after the documents have been read and the dates have been said, a letter that lays out terms without venom. And those terms were straightforward because I have learned that anything complicated gives cowards a place to hide, a redirection of a defined portion of the trust into a scholarship at the Children's Hospital in my daughter's name, a written apology to be read aloud to the congregation that my parents use as their mirror, and a standing commitment that any future trust distributions categorized as education will be matched, line for line, for medical hardship of direct descendants, or the petition will be filed the next morning with the exhibits already numbered, and I printed 2 copies and placed one in a sealed envelope with the attorney's card. As dusk rolled and I rehearsed the order of the reveal in my head the way you rehearse a difficult phone call, not because I wanted to perform, but because I wanted to prevent my grief from grabbing the wheel and driving us into a ditch of tears and shouting. So I set the sequence like a metronome in my mind. First the cosigner withdrawal letter and the hospital's verification of consequences, then the bursar's payment history and the donor plaque line, then the church video and the paragraph of the trust, and finally the letter with terms, and I told myself that I would not ask for empathy or forgiveness or even recognition. I would ask for signatures, and I would make it clear that the signatures are not for me. They're for a child whose name deserves to be carved into something that helps other children breathe. Stop everything and focus, I told myself as I slipped the folders into my bag and slid the church clip onto my phone for quick access, because the next hours are not about winning an argument at a table. They're about changing the direction of a family's money and its story in one clean motion, and when I locked my door and headed to the car, the streetlights coming on like a countdown, I knew that by the time dessert would have been served, the people who told me they had nothing would finally understand what nothing looks like when you pair it with proof, and they would either sign the paper that turns their donations into something real, or they would watch me walk out and pull a lever they cannot unpull, and either way, the story would change tonight. When I finally agreed to meet my father, it was not because I suddenly felt a rush of forgiveness or because I wanted some tender family reunion before walking across the stage in my cap and gown, but because I knew that for the first time in years the power balance had shifted, and the same people who once discarded me without hesitation were now forced to acknowledge that the lies they embraced had backfired so badly that their golden daughter was unraveling in front of them, dragging their reputation and her engagement down with her. We chose a neutral place, a coffee shop near campus, and when he sat down across from me, looking older and smaller than I remembered, I could see that he hadn't come with answers or apologies, but with desperation. The kind that makes a parent willing to backtrack on their own pride when the alternative is losing everything they had staked on appearances. He began cautiously, almost like he was afraid I would walk out, saying that Brooke was in trouble because her fiancé's family had quietly run background checks and started asking uncomfortable questions about credit issues and old messages that painted a very different picture from the one she had sold them. And then he admitted what I had always known but had never heard said out loud. She had made things up about me years ago because she was jealous, because she was scared of being overshadowed, and because painting me as a failure gave her room to shine. He said it quickly, like ripping off a bandage, and then he looked at me, waiting for me to give him some sort of absolution, but I didn't, because what mattered wasn't that he said it, but that now I had it in my hands as leverage. I reached into my bag and slid across the table a single-page document I had typed up the night before, a list I titled Corrections. It wasn't a manifesto or some long speech about betrayal. It was a plain, businesslike sheet with bullet points. The reverse store card tied to my social security number, the FERPA file correction from high school, the identity theft affidavit and IRS protection pin, and at the bottom a blank line labeled Family Statement. I explained, calmly and without raising my voice, that I was about to start a new job that required a background check, and I could not risk their silence or denial sabotaging my future, so what I wanted was simple. Their signatures acknowledging that they had acted on false information, that my record had been corrected, and that they supported those corrections moving forward. Then I laid out the terms, not angrily, not with cruelty, but with the same measured tone I would use in a professional negotiation, because that was exactly what it had become. First, I wanted both my parents to sign a short statement admitting that they had believed and acted on lies, and that they supported the factual corrections now attached to my record. Second, I wanted Brooke to send written apologies to me, to Ms. Dalton, and to my Aunt Carla, explicitly admitting that she had misused my identity for the credit card and had fed false accusations into the school system, because without that admission, the corrections would always feel incomplete. Third, I wanted repayment of the college fund that had mysteriously vanished when I was kicked out, not in one lump sum, but in steady monthly deposits, even if they were small, because I needed to see them invest in repairing the financial damage they had shrugged off. I told him clearly that I was not going to post anything online, I was not going to ruin Brooke's engagement publicly, and I was not going to drag our family name through the mud, but I would also not accept empty words anymore, because the only thing that had ever protected me against her lies was paper, and from this point forward everything would be written, signed, and dated. The offer was simple: give me signatures and documents before the graduation ceremony ended, and I would consider the matter handled privately. Fail to do so, and I would forward the full file, the store card evidence, the FERPA corrections, the affidavit, the transcript blocks, and the screenshots of Brooke's old messages to anyone who needed to know, whether that was her fiancé, his family, or anyone else. For the first time, I saw my father hesitate, because it was no longer a daughter begging for approval, it was an adult presenting terms, and he knew I wasn't bluffing. He reached for the pen, his hand trembling slightly, and for a second I thought it was done, but just then his phone lit up and he excused himself to answer. I sat silently, sipping my coffee, while his expression darkened, and when he came back, his face looked drained. Brooke had just called him in a panic because her fiancé had walked out after seeing screenshots she couldn't explain away, and she was demanding that Dad fix it for her. He stared at the paper in front of him, then at me, and I could tell he was weighing decades of family loyalty against the undeniable reality that his daughter's lies had detonated. And the only person who held the cleanup plan was the one they had thrown away. The moment stretched, uncomfortable and almost surreal, and while he finally placed the pen back on the table, his hand hovered, shaking, as if he knew that once he signed, there was no going back. That he would be admitting in writing not only that I had been wronged, but that they had chosen the wrong child to believe, and that acknowledgement would live forever in my file, not just in memory. And as I watched him hesitate, I realized that this wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about rewriting the power structure of my family, about proving that the truth didn't need shouting or dramatics, only patience, paper, and leverage. And the question that hung in the air wasn't whether he would sign, but how far I was willing to push if he didn't. Graduation day should have been about the ceremony, the cap and gown, the moment of walking across the stage while hearing my name announced. Yet, even as I shook hands and smiled for the obligatory photos with classmates who had become more like family than my actual blood, I knew that the real milestone of that day had nothing to do with the diploma in my hand and everything to do with the fact that, for the first time, my parents could not twist the narrative or bury the truth under years of denial, because the evidence I carried in my bag was stronger than any speech they could deliver, and the signatures I demanded were the only way forward if they wanted even the faintest chance of salvaging the image they had spent so long protecting. When I sat down with my father again later that evening, after the ceremony and the obligatory photos, he handed me the signed statement, his name written in sharp strokes that seemed almost angry yet at the same time resigned, and not long after, my mother appeared, defensive at first, accusing me of being cruel for forcing this into writing, but slowly deflating as she realized there was no other option left, until she, too, added her name to the page, her expression heavy with years of unspoken guilt that she had no words to explain. For a brief second, I felt a flicker of satisfaction, not because I had humiliated them, but because I had finally broken the cycle of gaslighting and excuses, and I had turned their silence into proof. Proof that the daughter they abandoned had been telling the truth all along. Of course, the final confrontation was always going to be with Brooke, and she showed up red-eyed and frantic, demanding that I help her fix things with her fiancé, swearing that if I didn't intervene he would never listen to her side and the life she had planned would collapse, but by then I was immune to her dramatics. I told her calmly that I was not her shield, not her scapegoat, and not her cleanup crew, and that if she wanted me to be part of her story moving forward, then the only contribution I was willing to make was the truth. I placed a template letter in front of her, one I had drafted with Eric's guidance, stating in simple legal language that she had used my social security number to open a card without permission, that she had seeded false statements in high school records, and that she committed to never using my identity or dragging my name into her messes again. I did not raise my voice, I did not threaten her with exposure, I simply told her that if she wanted to leave that coffee shop with even a fraction of dignity, she would sign, and when she hesitated, her hands trembling, I reminded her that her fiancé already had screenshots of her messages, and her only chance of rebuilding trust in any part of her life would come from acknowledging her actions on paper rather than pretending they had never happened. She signed, the pen scratching across the page like a reluctant confession, and I folded the paper and placed it neatly into my folder without triumph or gloating, because the victory wasn't in watching her cry. It was in knowing that for the rest of her life, that notarized letter could exist as a barrier between me and whatever lies she might invent again. I didn't rush to send it to her fiancé or blast it online. Instead, I forwarded only the apology she wrote to Ms. Dalton and my Aunt Carla, ensuring that the corrections to my records were complete and the people who mattered most knew the truth directly from her own words. It wasn't about vengeance anymore, it was about closure. About rewriting the narrative in the official channels where it had first been poisoned. The next step was preparing for my job, because while Brooke was spiraling over her ruined engagement, I had a future to protect, so I sent a clean packet to HR at the company where I had been offered a position, a copy of the police report number, the identity theft affidavit confirmation, and the corrected school file letter, ensuring that if anything suspicious popped up during their background check, the explanation was already documented in advance. It was preventative, professional, and definitive, and it guaranteed that no echo of Brooke's past lies could follow me into this next chapter of my life. As I left the coffee shop that night, the folder heavy in my bag and the diploma tucked under my arm, I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't in dramatic public takedowns or social media explosions, but in the calm, methodical way I had turned every accusation, every smear, every betrayal into documented evidence that not only cleared my name, but also locked the truth into systems where her influence could never reach. I walked out not as the daughter begging to be believed, but as the woman who had learned to turn pain into precision, and who no longer needed her family's approval to define her worth. Later, my father sent a short message saying he was proud. My mother followed with a clumsy apology that felt more like habit than sincerity, and Brooke remained silent, her absence from my phone more powerful than any insult she could have delivered. And I knew then that while the damage she had done had shaped my life in ways I would never fully escape, I had finally ensured that it could never destroy me again, because the story now belonged to me. And the power to decide who I allowed into my future was mine alone. Still, as I placed the signed papers into a safe folder and turned off my phone for the night, a thought lingered at the edge of my mind, a question I didn't want to answer yet couldn't shake. If one day Brooke came to me not with lies or excuses, but with a real plea for help, not to hide her mistakes but to change, would I open the door or would I leave it closed forever? The uncertainty of that answer was the most freeing realization of all, because for once, I was the one who got to choose.